So please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk about this report that was done jointly between the National Intelligence Council, where I come from, and the European Union's Institute for Security Studies. I'd like to spend a little time talking about the background to the report and then give you some of the broad brush conclusions from it. Then Giovanni can delve down into some of the details of that report before we have a discussion on it. The background to it is that the National Intelligence Council, as I say, where I'm from in the U.S., puts together every 4 years a global trends report looking out 15, 20 years. The last one we published was in November 2008, and we actually did present it here at the European Parliament in December or January after publication. The idea for doing the publication is to actually help the incoming U.S. administration to think broadly and to think out 15, 20 years and help them with their efforts on beginning to develop strategies for the not only for the long term but for the medium and short term. One of the conclusions of that report is that we were facing a governance deficit over the next several decades. And there are various reasons for that I won't go into in any depth, but it was apparent that governance was an issue that we needed to spend more time understanding and then also thinking about what the opportunities were for changing that governance deficit. Now, as Giovanni may talk about, his organization also does a long-term study and came up with some of the same conclusions. And obviously, it seemed to me to make perfect sense that the U.S. and the EU, given our roles in actually creating and running the global governance institutions that we know today, that we should also pull together and think about what changes are needed over the horizon, what are the implications of what I was saying about a deficit. So as a result of that pooling of efforts and resources, we designed a project, as the chairman was saying, where we went out and visited every major power center in the world in order to understand how they looked on governance issues and to understand where they were seeing the trends on those governance issues. Now, as the title would indicate, we said at global governance at a critical juncture. Our concern, as in the earlier reports, was that for various reasons that the institutions, the global institutions, and even the regional institutions that we know are not adequate for what we see as the trends going forward. And there are two major reasons for coming to this conclusion. And the first was that the challenges ahead. Obviously, the governance system, the one that we have known since '45, has been reasonably successful. You could make that case. But the challenges looking forward, and we talked about several in particular in the report. These are ones dealing with resource issues, water, food, energy, also dealing with conflict, dealing with countries left behind, not being able to grow as the rest of the world has, and also issues, as we put it, on the horizon. These are things that obviously we can see as a growing concern and problem. One of these was migration. Another was on biotech revolution. Ones that, in one way or the other, various governance institutions had been trying to tackle, but not successfully, and ones in which there needed to be a broader framework. Now that's one set of issues, is basically the challenges, which were a product of what we have been seeing for some time, which is the globalization, so the greater interdependence, which has in large part very beneficial results for everyone. You can see about the growing prosperity around the world, but also because of this interdependence, there are issues, as I've just described, that are raised, and that because of that interdependence, we need a much greater global effort. So that's one set of concerns. The other was on the growing multipolarity in the world. And so the trips in that sense were very illuminating. I think we have, in going around, and Chairman has mentioned all the places that we have gone, and I won't go into depth on each of their particular takes on global governance, but in essence, they saw the governance system as designed for 1945, post-Second World War. It did not take into consideration the rise of these new states. They didn't have another idea in mind in terms of organizing the international order. They also saw the UN particularly as a legitimate institution. But over time, unless there were large-scale reforms, that system, the current system, would lose legitimacy in their eyes. They're, as probably made clear in their mind, unlike I think more in the Western mind, the emphasis was on legitimacy. I think it's fair to say that a lot of Western countries have thought much more about the efficiency and effectiveness, and that should be the primary criteria. I would say from our trips, the emphasis was much more on legitimacy. Now, as I said before, these are emerging states. Most of them are still poor states, even though they play. China is now the second largest economic power. They're having a huge global impact, but their point of view is still from a state that is rapidly emerging, pulling up what has been the majority of their population in extreme poverty. So their emphasis and focus will remain much more inward. At the same time that they're looking for these bigger changes to these institutions on a global scale. I expect that, as we put in the report, that the initiative for looking at global governance will remain in the West for the time being. And in a sense, we have an opportunity to think about how to change global governance. If we don't, however, our feeling was that the whole international system could be undermined. We have 4 scenarios that we lay out. I'll go briefly over those, and the first one was what I think is the current kind of trend, which is muddling through. We saw that as the most likely one, but one that was not going to be sustainable given the kind of crises over some of these issues that we talked about in the report, over the challenges. The second, which was equally likely and conceivable, was the fragmentation. And I think we have seen some of that already following the financial crisis. This is slowdown in globalization, the growth of much more regionalism. It's not necessarily a good sign, and over a longer time period, of course, it would mean the undermining of the global system. And the third one, which was the positive one, was a concert future for global governance. This seemed unlikely to us, except if there was a huge crisis which more or less triggered cooperation and understanding that unless everybody pulled together, the system was going to come apart. And the final one was conflict, which I think we can't be too dismissive of. It seems very unlikely at this point, but we have to remember that in terms of the other globalization eras, that they both ended in failure. It's not inconceivable that we could also have such an outcome for this, what has been in many ways a very positive period of human history. I'll leave it there and allow Giovanni to go much more into the details of the study.